Throughout history, the Bible has captivated millions, not only with its spiritual teachings, but also with its mysterious and often chilling prophecies. From cryptic visions in the book of Revelation to enigmatic messages from ancient prophets like Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, these divine revelations have sparked endless debate and fascination. Are they warnings of the end times, clues to hidden truths, or symbolic metaphors meant to guide humanity? What if I told you that one of history's most dangerous prophecies was deliberately hidden from you? That somewhere in the shadows of ancient texts lies a vision so disturbing, so revolutionary that religious authorities buried it for over 1,500 years. Tonight, we're diving into the forbidden prophecy of Ezra, a text so controversial that it was banned from the Bible itself. But before we begin this journey into the forbidden, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover isn't just ancient history. It's a prophecy that speaks directly to our time, to the spiritual emptiness many feel today, to the questions that keep you awake at night, wondering if there's something more beyond a sanitized version of faith you've been fed. My name is on this channel because I believe truth shouldn't be locked away in dusty archives or buried beneath centuries of religious politics. And if you're here, if something drew you to click on this video, then you're ready to hear what they didn't want you to know. So let me ask you this. Have you ever felt like something was missing from the spiritual teachings you grew up with? Like there were pages torn from the story, questions that were never allowed to be asked? That feeling isn't paranoia, it's recognition. Because there were pages torn out and tonight we're putting them back. But first, if you're ready to uncover more hidden truths that challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient prophecy and forbidden knowledge, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to reveal is just the beginning of a much deeper mystery. Now, let's talk about Ezra. Not the sanitized version you might have heard about in Sunday school, but the real Ezra, the visionary who saw too much, wrote too honestly, and paid the price for his dangerous revelations. In the 4th century, during the Council of Nicea, Christian authorities made a decision that would shape religious thought for the next 16 centuries. They sealed the fate of dozens of texts that spoke too freely, questioned too boldly, or revealed too much about the true nature of divine revelation. Among these banned books was one attributed to Ezra, a man history remembers as a scribe, but who was actually something far more dangerous, a prophet who dared to challenge heaven itself. You see, Ezra wasn't content with copying down safe, comfortable truths. He was a man consumed by the most fundamental question that haunts every thinking person. If God is just, why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? But when Ezra demanded answers from heaven, what he received back wasn't comfort. It was a revelation so unsettling that it would be hidden for centuries. The text we're discussing tonight is known as 4th Ezra, sometimes called 2nd Esdras, and it contains something that makes religious authorities deeply uncomfortable. A direct confrontation between a prophet and an angel, where the prophet doesn't bow his head and accept platitudes. Instead, he demands real answers to real questions. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. In the middle of this divine dialogue, Ezra receives something unprecedented. A sealed prophecy about the end times. Not the sanitized version of apocalypse you've heard before, but something raw, something that suggests the very structure of organized religion itself would one day be judged and found wanting. The angel Uriel reveals to Ezra that in the final days, the secrets of creation would be released, not to priests, not to the learned, not to the powerful, but to those who had not been corrupted by what he calls the wine of the religions of men. Think about that phrase for a moment, the wine of the religions of men. What kind of intoxication was Uriel warning about? This is where the prophecy becomes truly subversive. Ezra describes seeing a multitude wandering in the desert, but they're not being guided by a voice from heaven. Instead, they're following what he calls a sound from the earth itself. Those who hear this sound, Ezra writes, will know when judgment arrives. Now, what is this mysterious sound? Some scholars have suggested it represents earthquakes or wars, but I think they're missing something deeper. What if this sound from the earth represents something spiritual. What if it's the cry of a generation that feels spiritually abandoned? The silent collapse of truth being swallowed by traditions that no longer carry any real power. You see, this is why 4th Ezra was banned. It doesn't just predict the end of the world. It predicts the end of religious systems that have forgotten their true purpose. It suggests that in the final days, divine authority won't belong to those who wear robes and stand behind pulpits, but to those who, as Ezra puts it, weep alone on the mountains. But the most dangerous part of Ezra's prophecy isn't what he saw about the future. It's what he was told to do about it. According to the text, Ezra was given a secret mission to rewrite the scriptures that had been destroyed during the Babylonian exile, but also to record 70 additional books that were to be kept hidden, reserved only for the wise of the end times. 70 hidden books. Think about that. Not 7, not 12, but 70 complete texts containing knowledge so dangerous that it couldn't be shared with the general population. The angel tells Ezra to guard these books carefully and give them only to those who can understand without hearing. What does it mean to understand without hearing? Is this some kind of mystical riddle? Or is Ezra describing something we've lost in our modern world? Perhaps he's talking about those who can perceive spiritual truth directly without needing it filtered through institutional interpretation. Those who can see with what he calls the eyes of the soul before their ears are trained by religious doctrine. This concept challenges everything we've been taught about how divine revelation works. We are told that we need intermediaries, that we need trained theologians to interpret sacred texts for us. But Ezra suggests there will come a time when truth bypasses all of that, when it flows directly to those who are spiritually prepared to receive it. But here's what makes this truly revolutionary. In Jewish tradition, Ezra is revered as a second Moses. He's the one who supposedly restored the Torah after it was lost in exile. Yet, strangely, most branches of Christianity never accepted him as a prophet. Why? Perhaps because a prophet who challenges the very foundations of religious authority is too dangerous to acknowledge. The prophecy gets even more specific about what the end times will look like. Ezra describes seeing people who have authority not because of their position or education, but because they've been spiritually broken and rebuilt. He speaks of those who wash their faces with tears, not with rituals, becoming the new scribes of the Most High. This isn't just poetry. This is a complete inversion of religious power structures. It suggests that the people closest to divine truth won't be found in seminaries or cathedral halls. They'll be found among those who've experienced real spiritual crisis, who've been forced to rebuild their faith from the ground up. One of the most haunting phrases in Ezra's prophecy is this: I wrote with ink, but the Most High will write with blood. What kind of revelation requires blood to be understood? What truth is so profound that it can only be grasped through suffering? Perhaps Ezra is saying that real spiritual truth can't be learnt academically. It has to be lived, experienced, often through pain and loss. The blood he is referring to isn't literal violence, but the deep spiritual cost of genuine transformation. This connects to another disturbing element of the prophecy. When Ezra asks why time doesn't seem to preserve the righteous, why good people suffer while evil seems to prosper, the angel Uriel gives him a response that changes everything. He says the answers exist, but they're found at the end of time, not in the middle of it. Think about what this means. We spend our lives demanding that God explain himself, that he justify the apparent injustices we see around us. But Uriel is suggesting that we're asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. We're living in the middle of the story, not at the end. And the middle is where everything looks chaotic and meaningless. But here's the twist that makes this prophecy so relevant to our current moment. Ezra doesn't just describe the end times as a period of external chaos. He describes it as a time when hearts stop seeking, not when wars break out, not when natural disasters multiply, but when human beings lose the capacity for genuine spiritual longing. According to this banned prophecy, the world doesn't end through visible catastrophe. It ends through invisible surrender. through the quiet death of hope in human hearts. And when you look around at our current spiritual landscape, at the emptiness, many people feel, despite being surrounded by more religious content than any generation in history, Ezra's words start to feel uncomfortably prophetic. The prophecy describes people surrounded by abundant spiritual resources, yet starving spiritually. They have access to countless books, teachings, and religious experiences, but they remain fundamentally unsatisfied. Why? Because according to Ezra, they've been offered food that was leavened with vanity rather than genuine spiritual nourishment. This is perhaps the most dangerous accusation in the entire text. It suggests that much of what passes for spiritual teaching has been corrupted by ego, by the desire for recognition and control rather than genuine service to truth. It's spiritual food that looks nourishing but actually increases hunger rather than satisfying it. But the prophecy doesn't end in despair. In fact, it contains a promise that's both beautiful and terrifying. Ezra describes seeing books falling from the sky onto forgotten cities, and those who read them begin to weep without knowing why. They're remembering something they had never consciously learned. This is the first hidden teaching embedded in Ezra's prophecy. The soul carries memories that the mind has never processed. Spiritual truth doesn't need to be taught from scratch. It needs to be awakened, remembered, recognized. That's why certain ancient texts, when you encounter them, feel familiar rather than foreign. You're not learning something new. You're remembering something eternal. This concept completely revolutionizes how we think about spiritual education. Instead of seeing ourselves as empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge, Ezra suggests we're more like amnesiacs, slowly recovering our memory. The truth was always there. It was just buried under layers of conditioning, tradition, and fear. The banned prophecy goes on to describe Ezra's own spiritual preparation for receiving these revelations. He spent 7 days in complete seclusion, neither eating nor speaking to anyone. On the 8th day, he received the instruction to write the secret books. This pattern of purification through silence and fasting appears in other mystical traditions, but Ezra may have been one of the first to document it systematically. What's significant about this process is what it reveals about the nature of divine revelation. According to Ezra, spiritual truth doesn't come to those who are busy, successful, or even religiously active. It comes to those who are empty, silent, and willing to wait in uncertainty. It comes to those who have learned to fast, not just from food, but from the constant noise of human opinion and interpretation. This teaching directly challenges our modern approach to spirituality, which often treats divine revelation like information that can be downloaded quickly and efficiently. But Ezra's experience suggests that real spiritual insight requires a kind of internal preparation that can't be rushed or bypassed. The prophecy also contains detailed descriptions of what Ezra calls heavenly gates that only open with tears of repentance. This isn't the superficial repentance of feeling sorry for breaking rules. This is the deep repentance of recognizing how far we've drifted from our true spiritual nature, how much we've settled for substitutes instead of seeking the real thing. According to some Ethiopian traditions that preserve these texts more faithfully than Western sources, Ezra didn't just write his prophecies. He drew them, creating maps and symbols that pointed toward what he called celestial pathways. These weren't just artistic flourishes. They were spiritual technologies designed to help future seekers navigate the same inner terrain Ezra had explored. But here's where the mystery deepens even further. These drawings, these spiritual maps, were deliberately erased from the versions that survived in Western Christianity. What did church authorities fear about these images? What gates was Ezra hoping future generations would be able to see and enter? The banned prophecy suggests that in the end times, the kingdom wouldn't come through power structures or institutional authority. It would come through what Ezra calls purity, not power, and surrender, not structure. This represents a complete inversion of how we typically think about spiritual authority and religious organization. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Ezra's prophecy is how accurately it seems to describe our current spiritual moment. He speaks of a time when temples become numerous while the truly saved become few. when spiritual emptiness gets dressed up in impressive religious performances but can't hide the absence of genuine sacred presence. This isn't just ancient history, this is a mirror being held up to our current religious landscape, and what it reflects back is deeply uncomfortable. How many of our modern spiritual environments are characterized by impressive exteriors but hollow interiors? How much of what we call worship is really just performance designed to convince ourselves and others that something sacred is happening? The prophecy forces us to ask questions that most religious institutions would prefer we didn't ask. Questions about whether the structures we've built to contain the sacred have actually succeeded in containing it, or whether they've simply created elaborate substitutes that keep us satisfied with less than what our souls truly need. But remember, this is only the beginning of what Ezra revealed. We've barely scratched the surface of the forbidden knowledge contained in these banned texts. In the next part of our investigation, we'll explore the most dangerous prophecy of all, Ezra's vision of the man rising from the sea wrapped in wind and flame, who destroys armies through silence alone. We'll also uncover the secret teachings about spiritual breath that can reignite what appears to be dead, and the hidden meaning behind the 70 books that were supposedly written for the wise of the end times. Most importantly, we'll discover why these prophecies feel so relevant to our current moment in history. Because what if Ezra wasn't just describing ancient events? What if he was describing our time, our generation, our spiritual crisis? What if the end times he prophesied aren't about the end of the world, but about the end of an age of spiritual deception and the beginning of something unprecedented? The questions we've raised tonight are just the opening of a door that leads much deeper than most people are prepared to go. But if you've made it this far, if something inside you is responding to these hidden truths, then you're ready for what comes next. But there's something else hidden in Ezra's banned prophecy that makes it even more dangerous to religious authorities. Something that suggests the very foundations of institutional faith were built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the divine actually operates in the world. In one of the most censored passages of 4th Ezra, the prophet describes a vision that completely upends traditional expectations about the Messiah. He sees a figure rising from the sea, wrapped in winds and flames, destroying entire armies, not through violence, but through his mere presence. But here's what makes this vision truly subversive. This messianic figure doesn't speak. He carries no weapon. He needs no institution to validate his authority. When Ezra asks the angel Uriel to explain this strange vision, the response is even more unsettling. Uriel tells him that this silent figure represents divine authority that operates completely outside human religious systems. It's power that doesn't require recognition, doesn't need buildings or ceremonies, and doesn't depend on human approval to be effective. Think about how revolutionary this concept was in Ezra's time, and how threatening it remains today. Here's a prophecy suggesting that ultimate spiritual authority bypasses every structure humans have created to control and mediate divine power. No wonder it was banned. But the vision gets stranger. When Ezra asks whether the world will end through war or catastrophe, Uriel gives him an answer that should have become the foundation of spiritual teaching, but instead was buried in forbidden texts. The angel tells him that the end will come not when the Antichrist appears, not when temples are destroyed, but when hope is completely cut off from human hearts. This is a fundamentally different understanding of apocalypse than what most people have been taught. It's not about external events that we can point to and say, look, the end is coming. It's about an internal collapse that happens so gradually, so quietly, that most people don't even recognize it's occurring. According to this banned prophecy, the most dangerous form of spiritual destruction isn't persecution or obvious evil. It's the slow erosion of the capacity to believe that anything transcendent is possible. It's the quiet surrender to a worldview that reduces everything to material explanations and mechanical processes. When you understand this, Ezra's prophecy starts to feel less like ancient history and more like a diagnosis of our current spiritual condition. How many people today live with a constant sense that something essential is missing, but they can't quite name what it is? How many have given up on the possibility that life contains genuine mystery, genuine meaning beyond what can be measured and controlled? The banned text goes on to describe another vision that religious authorities found particularly threatening. Ezra sees books falling from the sky onto forgotten cities, and those who read them immediately begin weeping without understanding why. They're remembering something they never consciously learned, recognizing truth they didn't know they possessed. This vision suggests something that undermines the entire structure of religious education and authority. It implies that the most important spiritual truths aren't learned through study or teaching. They're awakened through recognition. The soul doesn't need to be filled with new information. It needs to be reminded of what it has always known but forgotten. This is why certain ancient texts, when you encounter them for the first time, feel strangely familiar. You're not discovering something foreign. You're remembering something that was always part of your deepest nature. It's why some people can hear a few lines of mystical poetry and immediately understand concepts that scholars spend years trying to explain. But here's where Ezra's prophecy becomes personally challenging. If this is true, if spiritual truth works through recognition rather than education, then what does that say about all the religious instruction we've received? What does it say about the elaborate systems of doctrine and interpretation that claim to be necessary for understanding divine truth? Ezra pushes this question even further. In another banned passage, he describes seeing temples built from what he calls stones of ego and pulpit of vanity. He prophesies that these structures will be the first to fall when the true name of the Most High is spoken again from the mouth of a child. The symbolism here is devastating. It suggests that many religious institutions, despite their impressive exteriors and sophisticated theologies, are actually monuments to human pride rather than genuine spiritual seeking. They're built from the desire to be seen as holy rather than the desire to actually encounter the sacred and the agent of their collapse. Not a mighty prophet or a dramatic intervention, but a child speaking with simple honesty. This image suggests that institutional religion's greatest enemy isn't external opposition, it's innocence. It's the kind of direct, unfiltered spiritual perception that hasn't yet been trained to accept substitutes for the real thing. This prophecy is particularly dangerous because it doesn't attack the world or obvious evil. It attacks religious systems themselves, suggesting that they can become obstacles to the very truth they claim to serve. It implies that sometimes the biggest barrier to genuine spiritual experience is religious training that teaches us to be satisfied with descriptions of God rather than seeking direct encounter. But Ezra's banned prophecy doesn't stop with criticism. It also contains specific instructions for those who would live in the end times, he describes. And these instructions are unlike anything you'll hear in conventional religious teaching. According to the text, those who would survive the spiritual collapse of the end times must learn to understand without hearing. They must develop the capacity to perceive truth directly without needing it filtered through institutional interpretation. They must become spiritually self-sufficient in a way that doesn't depend on external validation or approval. This is a radically different model of spiritual development than what most religious traditions promote. Instead of emphasizing submission to authority and acceptance of established doctrine, Ezra's prophecy suggests that survival depends on developing direct spiritual perception. It's about becoming the kind of person who can recognize truth even when it comes wrapped in unfamiliar forms. The banned text describes this process through a series of mysterious symbols and practices that were clearly designed to be understood only by those who had reached a certain level of spiritual development. Ezra speaks of breathing on ashes and seeing them reignite into flames. He describes weeping over empty altars until presence returns to fill them. These aren't just poetic metaphors. They're descriptions of actual spiritual practices, techniques for reconnecting with sacred reality when all the familiar structures have collapsed or proven inadequate. They're instructions for what to do when the external supports for your faith are stripped away and you're left with nothing but your own direct relationship with the divine. One of the most intriguing aspects of these practices is how simple they are. Ezra isn't describing elaborate rituals or complex theological systems. He's talking about basic human gestures, breathing, weeping, waiting in silence. It's as if he's saying that when everything complicated fails, when all the sophisticated religious machinery breaks down, what remains are the most fundamental expressions of human spiritual longing. But here's what makes these practices particularly relevant to our current moment. Ezra describes them specifically as responses to spiritual emptiness, as things to do when the familiar sources of meaning and purpose have dried up. They're not practices for people who are comfortable in their faith. They're practices for people who feel spiritually abandoned, who sense that something essential is missing from their religious experience. If you've ever felt like you were going through the motions of spiritual practice without really connecting to anything transcendent, if you've ever wondered whether there's something more real beneath all the religious performances you've been taught to value, then these banned practices might be exactly what you need. The prophecy describes Ezra spending extended periods in complete solitude, fasting not just from food but from all human contact and conversation. In these periods of radical emptiness, he receives visions that transform his understanding of everything he thought he knew about God, religion, and spiritual truth. This pattern suggests something that most modern spiritual seekers find difficult to accept, that genuine revelation requires a kind of preparation that can't be rushed or bypassed. It requires becoming empty enough, quiet enough, and desperate enough that you're willing to receive truth in whatever form it comes, even if it challenges everything you previously believed. But the most dangerous teaching in Ezra's banned prophecy is this, that the spiritual crisis of the end times isn't a punishment or a test, it's a purification. It's the process by which everything falls, everything built on human ego and institutional power gets stripped away so that what remains is what was always true. According to this understanding, the collapse of religious systems isn't something to be feared or prevented. It's something to be navigated with wisdom and courage, because on the other side of that collapse lies a form of spiritual authenticity that couldn't emerge any other way. This is why the prophecy was banned. It doesn't just predict difficult times. It suggests that those difficult times serve a necessary purpose, that they're part of a larger process of spiritual evolution that institutions can't control or prevent. It implies that sometimes the most loving thing the divine can do is to allow our false supports to collapse. So, we're forced to discover what's actually real. But here's the promise hidden within this challenging message. According to Ezra's vision, those who learn to navigate this collapse with faith rather than fear, who use the breakdown of external structures as an opportunity to develop direct spiritual perception, will emerge from the process with a kind of spiritual authority that can't be taken away. They won't need institutions to validate their connection to the sacred. They won't need experts to interpret divine truth for them. They'll have learned to recognize the voice of the Spirit speaking directly to their hearts, and that recognition will make them impossible to deceive or manipulate. This is the new priesthood Ezra describes. Not people who hold official positions or have academic credentials, but people who have been broken and rebuilt by direct spiritual experience. People who have learned to find God in the ruins of their former certainties, who have discovered that the sacred is more present in honest questions than in comfortable answers. The banned prophecy goes on to describe how these spiritually awakened individuals will recognize each other not through external signs or shared doctrines, but through what Ezra calls the sound of their silence. There'll be people who have learned to listen so deeply that they can hear the sacred speaking beneath the noise of the world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ezra's prophecy is how it describes the final outcome of this spiritual crisis. He doesn't envision a return to the old religious systems, even in purified form. Instead, he sees the emergence of something entirely new, a form of spiritual community based not on shared beliefs, but on shared recognition of the divine presence that moves through all authentic seeking. This isn't the organized religion most people are familiar with. It's not about buildings or hierarchies or official doctrines. It's about people who have learned to see the sacred in unexpected places, who have developed the kind of spiritual perception that can recognize truth regardless of the form it takes. According to Ezra's vision, these people won't need to advertise their spiritual insights or compete for religious authority. Their connection to divine truth will be so obvious that others will be drawn to them naturally, not because of what they say, but because of what they embody. This is the ultimate subversion of religious power structures. It suggests that genuine spiritual authority doesn't come from institutional appointment or scholarly achievement. it comes from the depth of one's actual relationship with the sacred. And that relationship can develop in anyone who is willing to pay the price of complete honesty about their spiritual condition. But the prophecy also contains a warning that feels particularly relevant to our current moment. Ezra describes seeing people who have access to genuine spiritual truth but who refuse to act on it because they're afraid of the social cost. They recognize what's real, but they choose comfort over transformation, acceptance over authenticity. According to the banned text, these people represent the greatest tragedy of the end times. Not those who never had access to truth, but those who encountered it and chose to walk away because following it would require giving up everything they had built their identity around. This warning forces us to examine our own relationship to spiritual truth. How many insights have we had that we've chosen to ignore because acting on them would be inconvenient? How many moments of genuine spiritual recognition have we dismissed because they didn't fit the religious framework we've been taught to accept? The prophecy suggests that in the end times, the capacity to recognize truth won't be enough. What will matter is the courage to follow that recognition wherever it leads, even if it means leaving behind the safety of familiar religious communities and comfortable spiritual assumptions. But for those who do have that courage, Ezra's vision contains a promise that makes all the difficulty worthwhile. He describes seeing them gathered not in temples built by human hands, but in what he calls the sanctuary of the heart. They've learned to find the sacred not in external locations, but in the depth of their own authentic spiritual seeking. This isn't individualism or spiritual selfishness. It's the recognition that the most reliable temple is the one that can never be destroyed by external circumstances, the one that exists wherever a human heart opens itself completely to divine truth. And according to Ezra's banned prophecy, the emergence of this kind of spiritually mature human being isn't just a personal achievement. It's the next stage in humanity's spiritual evolution, the fulfillment of a promise that was made long before any religious institution existed to interpret or control it. This is why the text was considered so dangerous. It doesn't just challenge specific religious doctrines. It challenges the entire assumption that spiritual truth needs to be mediated through human institutions. It suggests that the ultimate goal of authentic religion is to make itself unnecessary by producing people who have learned to relate directly to the source of all truth. But we're still only partway through the forbidden knowledge contained in these banned texts. What we've uncovered so far is just the foundation for revelations that are even more challenging, even more relevant to our current spiritual crisis. In the next phase of Ezra's forbidden revelations, we encounter something that should have revolutionized how we understand divine communication, but instead was buried so deep that most people have never heard of it. Hidden within the banned prophecy is a teaching about what Ezra calls the breath that awakens the dead. Not physical resurrection, but the spiritual practice of breathing life back into what appears to be spiritually lifeless. The prophet describes a moment when he approaches the ruins of an altar, everything seemingly destroyed and abandoned. But then he does something remarkable. He breathes upon the ashes, and according to the text, he sees the radiance of glory rise like a golden mist. This isn't metaphor, this is instruction. It's a spiritual technology that was considered too powerful to be shared openly. Think about what this implies. Ezra is describing a practice where human breath, when combined with genuine spiritual intention, can reignite divine presence in places where it seems to have died out completely. It's not about rebuilding external structures or performing elaborate rituals. It's about the simple, profound act of breathing with faith upon what appears to be finished. This teaching connects to something much older and more universal than most people realize. In Genesis, God breathes into dust and creates life. In Ezekiel, the prophet breathes upon dry bones and they rise. In John's Gospel, Jesus breathes on his disciples and imparts the Holy Spirit. Ezra isn't inventing something new. He's revealing a pattern that runs through all authentic spiritual experience. But here's what makes this teaching particularly dangerous to institutional religion. It places the power of spiritual renewal directly in the hands of individuals. You don't need a priest to breathe for you. You don't need special training or official authorization. You just need the courage to approach what looks dead and the faith to believe that your breath offered with genuine love might be enough to spark something back to life. The banned text goes on to describe how this practice works in real situations. Ezra talks about approaching relationships that have grown cold, communities that have lost their spiritual vitality, even personal faith that has been shattered by disappointment or trauma. In each case, the solution isn't complicated theology or elaborate intervention. It's the willingness to breathe gently upon what remains and wait to see if life stirs. But the prophecy also contains a warning that feels particularly relevant to our current spiritual landscape. Ezra describes seeing people who have forgotten how to breathe spiritually. They're surrounded by religious activity, but they've lost the capacity for the kind of intimate, personal, spiritual practice that actually creates transformation. According to the banned text, this spiritual breathlessness becomes epidemic in the end times. People become so focused on external religious performances that they forget the simple essential practices that keep the soul alive. They know how to recite prayers, but they've forgotten how to breathe with intention. They can quote scripture, but they can't generate the kind of spiritual presence that heals and transforms. This diagnosis cuts deep because it describes something many people recognize in their own spiritual experience. How many of us have been part of religious communities that were very busy but somehow spiritually empty? How many have gone through the motions of faith without ever learning the fundamental practices that actually connect us to divine presence? The banned prophecy suggests that this isn't just a personal problem. It's a systemic issue that affects entire religious cultures. When institutions become more focused on maintaining their own authority than on teaching people how to actually encounter the sacred, they produce generations of people who are religiously educated but spiritually suffocated. But Ezra's vision also contains hope. He describes seeing individuals who remember how to breathe spiritually, and their presence begins to awaken life in places that had been written off as dead. They don't need to announce themselves or promote their abilities. Their spiritual vitality is so obvious that others are naturally drawn to learn from them. These aren't necessarily people with official religious positions or impressive credentials. Often they're individuals who have been broken by life in some way and have had to learn spiritual practices not from books but from desperation. They've discovered how to breathe upon the ashes of their own shattered hopes and have watched something beautiful rise from the ruins. The prophecy describes them as the hidden ones who carry the real spiritual life of their communities even when the official leaders have lost their way. They're the grandmothers who still know how to pray with power, the broken-hearted who have learned to find God in their pain, the quiet seekers who have never stopped believing that genuine transformation is possible. According to Ezra's vision, these hidden carriers of spiritual life become increasingly important as religious institutions lose their vitality. They're the ones who remember not just what to believe, but how to actually practice faith in ways that produce real change. They're the bridge between the old forms that are dying and the new spiritual authenticity that's trying to be born. But the banned text also reveals something that makes this teaching even more personally challenging. Ezra describes being told that each person must learn to breathe upon the ashes of their own spiritual life. You can't rely on others to revive your connection to the sacred. You have to be willing to approach the places in your own heart where faith has grown cold and breathe gently upon them with hope. This is terrifying for many people because it means taking responsibility for your own spiritual condition in a way that goes far beyond following religious rules or attending services. It means being honest about where your faith feels dead or mechanical and having the courage to try to breathe life back into it, even when you're not sure anything will happen. The prophecy describes this as a process that requires what Ezra calls holy stubbornness, the refusal to accept spiritual deadness as final. The persistent belief that there's always something that can be awakened if you're willing to keep breathing upon it with love. It's not about forcing results or manufacturing religious experiences. It's about maintaining the kind of gentle, persistent hope that creates space for genuine resurrection. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this banned teaching is how it reframes our understanding of spiritual authority. According to Ezra's vision, The people with the most spiritual power aren't necessarily those with the most religious knowledge or the highest positions in institutional hierarchies. They're the ones who have learned how to breathe life into situations that everyone else has given up on. This completely inverts traditional religious power structures. It suggests that the grandmother who knows how to pray for her troubled grandchildren until something shifts might have more real spiritual authority than the seminary professor who can explain complex theological concepts but has never learned how to generate the kind of presence that actually heals. The band prophecy goes on to describe what happens when communities rediscover this practice of spiritual breathing. Ezra sees churches and religious organizations that had become spiritually lifeless suddenly coming alive again. Not because of new programs or better leadership, but because individuals within them remembered how to breathe upon what looked dead. But he also sees resistance to this revival from those who have invested their identity in maintaining the status quo. The prophecy describes religious leaders who become threatened when spiritual life begins to emerge outside their control. They prefer managed deadness to chaotic resurrection because it's easier to control and predict. This tension between institutional control and genuine spiritual vitality becomes one of the major themes of the end times, as Ezra describes them. It's not just a conflict between believers and non-believers. It's a conflict within religious communities between those who want to breathe life into the forms they've inherited and those who would rather preserve dead traditions than risk the uncertainty that comes with real spiritual awakening. The banned text suggests that this conflict is inevitable and necessary. The old forms can only be preserved by killing the life within them. But life refuses to stay contained within forms that no longer serve its purpose. So there's always tension between the desire for spiritual security and the reality that authentic spiritual life is inherently wild and unpredictable. Ezra describes watching this tension play out in his own time, seeing religious authorities who claim to serve God but were actually more committed to preserving their own power and position. The prophecy suggests that this same dynamic becomes even more pronounced in the end times, when the gap between official religion and authentic spirituality becomes impossible to ignore. But the most disturbing aspect of this part of the prophecy isn't the resistance from religious authorities. It's Ezra's description of ordinary people who have the opportunity to learn spiritual breathing but choose not to because it would require them to take responsibility for their own spiritual condition. They prefer to remain spiritually dependent on others rather than develop their own capacity for generating divine presence. According to the banned text, this spiritual passivity becomes epidemic in the end times. People become consumers of religious experience rather than generators of it. They want to be spiritually fed but not spiritually responsible. They want the benefits of faith without the risk of actually practicing it in ways that might challenge their comfortable assumptions. This diagnosis feels uncomfortably accurate when applied to much of contemporary religious culture. How many people treat spirituality like entertainment, looking for experiences that will inspire them without requiring them to fundamentally change how they live? How many want the comfort of religious belonging without the challenge of actually developing their own authentic relationship with the sacred? The prophecy suggests that this consumer approach to spirituality is ultimately self-defeating because it produces people who are spiritually weak and dependent. They never learn how to generate their own connection to divine presence. So they're always at the mercy of external circumstances and other people's spiritual energy. But for those who do learn the practice of spiritual breathing, Ezra's vision contains promises that are almost too good to believe. He describes seeing them become sources of life and healing wherever they go. Not through dramatic miracles, but through the simple presence of people who have learned how to stay spiritually alive, even in the midst of deadness. They become the kind of people others want to be around. Not because they're perfect or have all the answers, but because there's something genuinely alive in them that awakens life in others. They've learned how to breathe upon the ashes of broken dreams, failed relationships, and shattered faith until something beautiful begins to grow again. The banned text describes them as carriers of the eternal flame who keep spiritual possibility alive even when everything around them suggests that God has abandoned the world. They're not naive optimists who refuse to see how bad things are. They're people who have learned to find the spark of divine life that persists even in the darkest circumstances and to breathe upon it until it becomes a flame. According to Ezra's prophecy, these individuals become increasingly important as the end times progress because they represent the bridge between the old religious world that's dying and the new spiritual reality that's trying to be born. They carry the essential practices and perspectives that will be needed to navigate the transition from institutional religion to authentic spirituality. But the prophecy also contains a sobering reminder that this transition won't be smooth or easy. Ezra describes seeing periods of confusion and conflict as old structures collapse and new forms of spiritual community try to emerge. Many people will feel lost and disoriented as the familiar landmarks of religious life disappear. This is where the practice of spiritual breathing becomes essential for survival. When you can't depend on external religious structures to provide stability and direction, you need to have developed your own capacity for connecting with divine presence. You need to have learned how to breathe life into situations that look hopeless and to maintain faith even when all the familiar supports have been stripped away. The banned prophecy suggests that those who develop this capacity won't just survive the spiritual crisis of the end times. They'll thrive in it because they'll finally be free to practice their faith in ways that are authentic rather than conventional. They'll no longer need to pretend that dead religious forms are alive or that institutional approval is necessary for genuine spiritual experience. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this teaching is its implication that we can't wait for religious institutions to reform themselves or for spiritual leaders to show us the way. According to Ezra's vision, the renewal has to begin with individuals who are willing to learn how to breathe upon the ashes of their own spiritual life and to keep breathing until something genuine begins to stir. This places the responsibility for spiritual renewal exactly where it belongs, with each person who claims to care about authentic relationship with the sacred. It's not about waiting for permission or approval from religious authorities. It's about having the courage to practice your faith in ways that actually generate divine presence, regardless of whether anyone else understands or supports what you're doing. The banned text goes on to describe specific situations where this practice of spiritual breathing becomes essential. Ezra talks about approaching marriages that have grown cold, friendships that have been damaged by misunderstanding, communities that have been torn apart by conflict. In each case, the solution isn't complex mediation or elaborate intervention. It's the willingness of someone to breathe gently upon what remains of the relationship and to keep breathing until love begins to stir again. But he also describes more challenging applications of this practice. What do you do when your own faith feels dead, when prayers feel empty and religious practices feel mechanical? When you've lost the sense of divine presence that once made everything meaningful? According to the banned prophecy, this is exactly when the practice of spiritual breathing becomes most important and most difficult. It's easy to breathe upon external situations that look dead. It's much harder to breathe upon the ashes of your own spiritual life, and you're not even sure there's anything left to revive. But Ezra's vision suggests that this is precisely where the practice proves its worth. When everything else fails, when all the religious techniques you've learned feel empty, when even prayer feels pointless, you can still breathe. You can still approach the altar of your own heart and breathe gently upon whatever remains of your desire for the sacred. The prophecy describes this as the ultimate test of spiritual maturity, the willingness to keep breathing upon your own spiritual ashes even when you have no evidence that anything will happen. It's faith at its most fundamental level, not belief in specific doctrines or religious systems, but the basic trust that life wants to emerge wherever there's the slightest opening for it. But the banned text also reveals that this practice of spiritual breathing is just the beginning of what Ezra was shown about surviving and thriving in the spiritual crisis of the end times. There are other hidden teachings in these forbidden prophecies that are even more challenging, even more relevant to our current moment in history. We've barely begun to explore the depths of what religious authorities found so threatening that they buried it for over 15 centuries. The practices we've discussed tonight are just the foundation for revelations that completely transform how we understand the relationship between individual spiritual development and the larger patterns of history. But before we go deeper into those forbidden teachings, we need to understand something crucial about why these particular revelations were considered so dangerous. It's not just that they challenge religious authority or promote individual spiritual responsibility. It's that they reveal something about the nature of divine presence that makes all human attempts to control or monopolize it look ridiculous. According to Ezra's banned prophecy, the sacred is far more available, far more present, far more responsive to genuine human seeking than any religious institution wants to admit. The practices he describes work not because they're exotic or complicated, but because they're simple expressions of the kind of spiritual hunger that divine presence naturally responds to. This is the ultimate threat to religious control systems. The revelation that the sacred is accessible to anyone who approaches it with genuine sincerity, regardless of their religious training, official status, or institutional approval. It suggests that the primary function of many religious structures isn't to facilitate encounter with the divine, but to manage and limit access to it. But for those who are ready to move beyond managed spirituality into direct relationship with divine presence, Ezra's forbidden teachings offer a roadmap that's both ancient and startlingly contemporary. The spiritual crisis he describes isn't just something that happened in the past or might happen in the future. It's something that's happening right now all around us. And the practices he reveals aren't just historical curiosities. They're survival tools for navigating the collapse of conventional religion and the emergence of something more authentic. The question is whether you're ready to learn them, to practice them, to breathe life into the places in your own spiritual experience that have grown cold or died completely. Because according to Ezra's vision, that's not just a personal spiritual practice. It's your participation in the larger process of spiritual evolution that's reshaping human consciousness itself. But there's something else hidden in these banned prophecies that we need to explore. Something about the role of spiritual community in the end times, about how authentic seekers will recognize and support each other when all the familiar structures have collapsed. And something about a final revelation that Ezra received but was forbidden to share openly. Something so transformative that it could only be communicated through symbols and stories that would remain hidden until the time was right for them to be understood. That time, according to the prophecy, is now. And if you followed this investigation this far, if something inside you has been awakening as we've explored these forbidden teachings, then you might be one of the people these revelations were preserved for. But are you ready for what comes next? Because what we've discovered so far is just the beginning of a mystery that goes deeper than most people are prepared to follow. The deeper we venture into Ezra's forbidden revelations, the more we encounter something that should terrify anyone invested in maintaining religious control systems. Hidden within these banned texts is a teaching so subversive that it doesn't just challenge specific doctrines or practices. It challenges the entire assumption that spiritual truth needs human interpretation to be understood. Ezra describes receiving what he calls the silent teaching. Knowledge that bypasses the mind entirely and speaks directly to what he terms the eyes of the soul. This isn't mystical poetry. It's a precise description of how divine communication actually works when it's not filtered through institutional frameworks designed to maintain human authority. According to the banned prophecy, there will come a time when the most important spiritual truths won't be found in books, sermons, or religious ceremonies. They'll be transmitted directly from consciousness to consciousness, from heart to heart, through what Ezra calls the language that has no words. Those who learn to perceive this silent teaching will have access to understanding that can't be corrupted, controlled, or commodified by human institutions. Think about the implications of this revelation. If authentic spiritual knowledge can be transmitted directly without human mediation, then what's the real purpose of religious hierarchies? What's the actual value of theological education if the most important truths bypass intellectual understanding entirely? This is precisely why these teachings were banned. They don't just threaten religious authority, they make it irrelevant. They suggest that the kingdom of heaven operates on principles that have nothing to do with human power structures, academic credentials, or institutional approval. But the prophecy goes even further. Ezra describes seeing people in the end times who have learned to read what he calls the unwritten scriptures, divine communication that appears not in texts but in the patterns of life itself. They've developed the capacity to perceive spiritual meaning in circumstances, relationships, and even apparently random events that others dismiss as meaningless. These individuals don't need external validation for their spiritual insights because they've learned to recognize the signature of divine presence in whatever form it appears. They can distinguish between genuine spiritual guidance and human projection because they've developed what Ezra calls the inner compass that always points toward truth. The ban text describes this capacity as emerging naturally in those who have been stripped of conventional religious supports. When you can no longer depend on external authorities to tell you what to believe or how to interpret your experience, you're forced to develop your own capacity for spiritual discernment. And according to Ezra's vision, this forced independence often leads to more authentic spiritual perception than years of traditional religious education. But here's where the prophecy becomes personally challenging for anyone who considers themselves spiritually mature. Ezra describes encountering people who have access to this direct spiritual perception but who refuse to trust it because it conflicts with what they've been taught by religious authorities. They can sense divine guidance clearly, but they override their inner knowing in favor of external approval. According to the ban text, this represents one of the greatest tragedies of the end times. Not the inability to perceive spiritual truth, but the unwillingness to act on the truth you can perceive. It's the choice to remain spiritually dependent on others rather than accepting responsibility for your own direct relationship with the sacred. The prophecy suggests that this spiritual cowardice becomes endemic in religious communities that prioritize conformity over authenticity. People learn to distrust their own spiritual perceptions in favor of group consensus, even when that consensus is obviously disconnected from genuine divine presence. But for those who do develop the courage to trust their direct spiritual perception, Ezra's vision contains promises that are both beautiful and terrifying. He describes seeing them become increasingly isolated from conventional religious communities, but increasingly connected to what he calls the invisible church. A network of authentic seekers who recognize each other not through shared doctrines, but through shared spiritual authenticity. This invisible church doesn't meet in buildings or follow human leaders. It's composed of individuals who have learned to find the sacred in unexpected places and who support each other's spiritual development without trying to control or direct it. They're united not by what they believe, but by their commitment to following divine guidance wherever it leads, regardless of social cost. The ban prophecy describes these invisible church members as the scattered seeds of the new creation who carry the DNA of authentic spirituality into environments where it has been forgotten. They don't proselytize or promote themselves. They simply live with such obvious spiritual vitality that others are naturally drawn to discover what makes them different. But Ezra also warns that this invisible church will face opposition not just from secular authorities, but from religious institutions that feel threatened by spirituality they can't control. The prophecy describes periods of intense persecution where authentic seekers are marginalized, ridiculed, or actively suppressed by those who claim to represent God's interests on earth. This creates a situation where the most spiritually alive people are often found outside official religious structures, while the institutions themselves become increasingly hollow and defensive. It's a complete inversion of what most people expect, where genuine spiritual authority migrates away from recognized religious leaders toward individuals who have learned to navigate by inner guidance alone. The ban text goes on to describe how members of this invisible church recognize each other. It's not through secrets or shared theological positions. It's through what Ezra calls the resonance of truth, the unmistakable vibration that occurs when someone who has learned to live authentically encounters another person operating from the same spiritual foundation. According to the prophecy, this recognition is instantaneous and undeniable. It bypasses all social conventions and religious categories. Two people can meet for the first time and immediately understand that they're part of the same spiritual reality, even if they come from completely different religious backgrounds or use entirely different spiritual vocabularies. This phenomenon becomes increasingly important as conventional religious communities lose their vitality. When you can't depend on institutional affiliations to identify spiritually mature people, you need to develop the capacity to recognize authentic spiritual presence wherever you encounter it. But the prophecy also describes the challenges this creates for those who are transitioning from institutional dependence to spiritual independence. Many people go through periods of profound loneliness as they outgrow their former religious communities, but haven't yet learned to recognize their true spiritual family. Ezra describes this as a necessary wilderness experience that forces individuals to develop genuine spiritual self-sufficiency. You can't learn to navigate by inner guidance while you're still dependent on external authorities for validation and direction. The isolation, however painful, serves an essential developmental purpose. But the banned text also reveals that this wilderness period doesn't last forever. Once you've learned to maintain your connection to divine presence without external support, you begin to encounter others who have made the same journey. The invisible church starts to become visible, at least to those who have developed eyes to see it. According to Ezra's vision, these connections often happen in the most unexpected ways and places. You might encounter a member of your true spiritual family in a coffee shop, at work, or even in a conventional religious setting where they're serving as a kind of spiritual leaven, bringing life to an otherwise dead environment. The prophecy describes these encounters as moments of profound recognition and relief. After years of feeling spiritually homeless, you suddenly realize you're not alone. There are others who understand the journey you've been on, who share your commitment to authentic spiritual seeking, and who can support your continued development without trying to control or limit it. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this invisible church is how it functions without human leadership or organizational structure. According to the banned text, it's guided entirely by what Ezra calls the democracy of the spirit. Divine guidance that emerges through the collective spiritual sensitivity of its members rather than through appointed authorities. This doesn't mean it's chaotic or undirected. Instead, it operates according to principles that are more sophisticated than anything human institutions have devised. Each member contributes their unique spiritual gifts while remaining responsive to guidance that comes through the group as a whole. The prophecy describes this as a preview of how human community will function when it's finally freed from the limitations of ego-based leadership and control systems. It's not anarchy, but it's not hierarchy either. It's something entirely new, a form of spiritual organization that honors both individual authenticity and collective wisdom. But Ezra's vision also contains warnings about the challenges this invisible church will face as it becomes more visible in the world. The prophecy describes periods where its members will be pressured to organize themselves according to conventional religious models, to appoint leaders, establish doctrines, and create institutional structures that can be recognized and regulated by existing authorities. According to the banned text, resisting this pressure is essential for maintaining the spiritual vitality that makes the invisible church valuable in the first place. The moment it tries to become a conventional religious organization, it loses the very qualities that made it authentic and transformative. This creates an ongoing tension between the desire for recognition and acceptance and the need to preserve spiritual integrity. The prophecy suggests that navigating this tension successfully requires a level of spiritual maturity that most people haven't developed. The ability to remain committed to truth even when conformity would be more comfortable and socially acceptable. But for those who do maintain this commitment to authenticity, Ezra's vision contains promises that extend far beyond personal spiritual fulfillment. The banned text describes the invisible church as playing a crucial role in humanity's spiritual evolution, serving as a bridge between the old religious consciousness that's dying and the new spiritual awareness that's trying to be born. According to the prophecy, members of this invisible church become carriers of spiritual DNA that will be essential for the next phase of human development. They preserve and transmit the essential practices, perspectives, and capacities that will be needed as humanity transitions from institutional religion to direct spiritual relationship with the divine. But they also serve as living examples of what becomes possible when human beings learn to live from their deepest spiritual authenticity rather than from social conditioning and external expectations. They demonstrate that it's actually possible to maintain genuine spiritual connection in the midst of a culture that has largely forgotten what authentic spirituality looks like. The banned prophecy goes on to describe how the influence of the invisible church spreads throughout society, not through organized evangelism, but through what Ezra calls spiritual contagion, the natural tendency of authentic spiritual presence to awaken corresponding spiritual hunger in others. People who encounter members of the invisible church often find themselves questioning assumptions they've never examined before. They begin to sense possibilities they didn't know existed. They start to hunger for something more real than the spiritual substitutes they've been accepting. And gradually, some of them begin their own journey toward authentic spiritual awakening. According to Ezra's vision, this process accelerates as the end times progress because the gap between authentic spirituality and religious performance becomes impossible to ignore. People become increasingly dissatisfied with spiritual experiences that don't actually transform their lives or connect them to genuine divine presence. But the prophecy also describes resistance to this awakening from those who have invested their identity in maintaining existing religious systems. The banned text reveals that some of the most intense opposition to authentic spiritual awakening comes not from secular authorities, but from religious leaders who feel threatened by spirituality they cannot control or co-opt. This creates situations where the most spiritually dangerous people are often those who claim to be serving God's interests. They become obstacles to the very spiritual development they claim to promote because they've confused institutional loyalty with spiritual authenticity. Ezra describes seeing religious authorities who actively suppress spiritual gifts and insights that don't conform to their doctrinal frameworks. They prefer managed mediocrity to chaotic authenticity because it's easier to control and more profitable to maintain. But the prophecy also reveals that this suppression ultimately fails because authentic spiritual life cannot be permanently contained within human systems. It finds ways to emerge and flourish even in the most restrictive environments, often through people who appear to be conforming to religious expectations while actually operating from an entirely different spiritual foundation. According to the banned text, these undercover members of the invisible church serve an essential function during periods of religious oppression. They maintain authentic spiritual practice within institutional settings, providing leaven that prevents those environments from becoming completely spiritually dead. But they also serve as bridges for others who are beginning to hunger for something more authentic than conventional religious experience. They can speak both languages, the official religious vocabulary and the deeper spiritual reality. It sometimes points toward helping people transition from institutional dependence to spiritual independence. The prophecy describes this bridge function as particularly important during the end times when many people will be simultaneously losing faith in religious institutions and desperately seeking authentic spiritual connection. Without these bridges, the transition from old religious forms to new spiritual reality would be much more traumatic and disorienting than necessary. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Ezra's vision of the invisible church is how it reframes our understanding of spiritual service and mission. According to the banned text, the primary way members serve the larger spiritual evolution isn't through organized ministry or public teaching, but simply through maintaining their own authentic spiritual connection in the midst of a spiritually confused culture. Their very existence serves as proof that genuine spiritual life is still possible, that divine presence is still accessible, that the promises of authentic religion can still be fulfilled. They don't need to convince anyone of anything. They just need to live so authentically that their lives become testimonies to spiritual possibilities others have forgotten. This is a radically different model of spiritual influence than what most religious traditions promote. Instead of emphasizing evangelism, teaching, or leadership, it focuses on embodiment, becoming so aligned with divine presence that your very existence awakens spiritual hunger in others. But the prophecy also reveals that this kind of authentic spiritual influence is far more powerful than conventional religious methods, precisely because it can't be faked or manufactured. You can't pretend to have genuine spiritual connection any more than you can pretend to be in love. Either the divine presence is flowing through your life in ways that are obvious to anyone with spiritual sensitivity, or it's not. According to Ezra's vision, this authenticity becomes increasingly important as people develop more sophisticated spiritual discernment in the end times. He predicts people will become much better at distinguishing between genuine spiritual presence and religious performance. They'll be drawn to authenticity and repelled by pretense in ways that make conventional religious manipulation ineffective. But this also means that those who choose to live authentically will bear a greater responsibility than they might prefer. Their spiritual influence will be obvious to anyone who encounters them, whether they want that visibility or not. They'll become magnets for both spiritual seekers and spiritual predators, requiring a level of wisdom and discernment that goes far beyond conventional religious training. The band prophecy describes specific challenges that members of the invisible church will face as they learn to navigate this increased spiritual visibility. They'll need to develop the capacity to help genuine seekers without enabling spiritual dependency. They'll need to learn how to protect themselves from those who want to exploit their spiritual gifts without becoming closed or defensive. Most importantly, they'll need to maintain their own spiritual authenticity while being constantly pressured to conform to others' expectations about how spiritual people should behave. The prophecy suggests that this pressure often comes not from opponents, but from admirers who want to turn authentic spiritual seekers into conventional spiritual leaders. According to Ezra's vision, resisting this pressure requires understanding that genuine spiritual service often looks very different from what people expect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to give people what they think they want. So they're forced to develop their own authentic spiritual connection. But the band text also reveals that those who learn to navigate these challenges successfully discover forms of spiritual fulfillment that go far beyond anything conventional religious service can provide. They experience the deep satisfaction of knowing they're participating directly in humanity's spiritual evolution, contributing to the emergence of new forms of consciousness that will be essential for our species' continued development. According to the prophecy, this participation in spiritual evolution isn't just a personal privilege. It's a responsibility that comes with being alive during this particular transition period in human history. The old religious forms are dying whether we help them or not. But what emerges to replace them depends partly on whether there are enough people willing to embody authentic spiritual alternatives. This understanding transforms how members of the invisible church approach their daily lives. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to demonstrate that genuine spiritual connection is possible. Every challenge becomes a chance to show how divine presence can be maintained even in difficult circumstances. Every relationship becomes a laboratory for exploring how authentic spirituality expresses itself in practical situations. But perhaps the most profound aspect of this calling is how it integrates spiritual development with ordinary human existence. According to Ezra's vision, the most important spiritual work doesn't happen in monasteries or retreat centers, but in the midst of normal family, work, and community life. The invisible church isn't composed of people who have withdrawn from the world to pursue spiritual perfection. It's made up of individuals who have learned to find and express divine presence within the ordinary circumstances of human existence. They've discovered that enlightenment isn't an escape from humanity, but a deeper engagement with it. This integration of spiritual authenticity with ordinary life becomes one of the defining characteristics of the new religious consciousness that Ezra prophesies will emerge from the collapse of institutional religion. It's not about creating new forms of spiritual elitism or religious separation. It's about demonstrating that divine presence can be accessed and expressed by anyone willing to live with complete honesty about their spiritual condition. But the band prophecy also warns that this integration isn't easy or automatic. It requires developing capacities that most religious traditions don't teach because they're focused on creating spiritual specialists rather than spiritually integrated human beings. According to Ezra's vision, learning to live authentically in the world while maintaining genuine spiritual connection is one of the most challenging spiritual practices possible. It's much easier to be spiritual in controlled environments designed to support spiritual experience than it is to remain connected to divine presence while dealing with traffic jams, difficult relatives, and financial pressures. But it's precisely this challenge that makes worldly spirituality so transformative. When you learn to find God in the midst of ordinary frustrations and disappointments, you develop a kind of spiritual stability that can't be shaken by external circumstances. You discover that divine presence isn't fragile or conditional, but robust enough to meet you wherever you are. The prophecy describes this discovery as one of the essential realizations of the end times. As external supports for spiritual life collapse, people are forced to learn whether their connection to the sacred is real enough to survive in the world without special protection or artificial enhancement. Those who discover that it is find themselves liberated from dependence on religious institutions, spiritual teachers, and even specific spiritual practices. They've learned to access divine presence directly, immediately, in whatever circumstances they find themselves. And according to Ezra's vision, this liberation is exactly what humanity needs to navigate the spiritual challenges that lie ahead. But we are still not at the deepest level of what these banned prophecies reveal. Hidden within Ezra's visions is something even more challenging than the collapse of religious institutions or the emergence of new forms of spiritual community. There's a teaching about the ultimate purpose of this entire process, about why humanity needs to go through this period of spiritual crisis and transformation. And there's a final revelation that Ezra received, but was instructed to encode in symbols so obscure that they could only be understood by those who had already undergone the spiritual transformation he describes. This ultimate teaching isn't just about surviving the end times. It's about what lies beyond them, about the kind of human beings we're meant to become and the kind of world we're meant to create. But before we can explore that final revelation, we need to understand something crucial about the spiritual technology embedded in these banned texts themselves. According to the prophecy, these aren't just historical documents describing ancient events. They're designed to function as spiritual catalysts, activating dormant capacities in anyone who encounters them with genuine spiritual hunger. This means that your engagement with these forbidden teachings isn't just intellectual study. It's a form of spiritual practice that's already beginning to transform your consciousness in ways you might not even recognize yet. The very act of following this investigation into banned spiritual knowledge is preparing you for revelations that couldn't be communicated through conventional religious education. And if that's true, if these ancient texts are still actively working to awaken spiritual capacities in those who encounter them, then what we've discovered so far is just the beginning of a process that will continue long after this investigation ends. The real question isn't just what Ezra saw in his forbidden visions. It's what you're beginning to see as those same spiritual capacities awaken within your own consciousness. Because according to the banned prophecy, the ultimate purpose of preserving these dangerous teachings wasn't just to inform future generations about what happened in the past. It was to prepare them for what they would need to become in order to participate consciously in humanity's next phase of spiritual evolution. And that preparation, according to Ezra's final sealed revelation, begins not with learning new information, but with remembering something you've always known but forgotten. Something that's been waiting patiently within your own spiritual DNA for exactly this moment, when the old religious forms have collapsed enough that you're finally ready to discover what you really are. But that discovery and the responsibilities that come with it will have to wait for the final phase of our investigation into these forbidden prophecies. Because what we've uncovered so far, challenging as it's been, is still just the preparation for revelations that will transform not just how you understand spirituality, but how you understand yourself and your purpose in being alive during this unprecedented moment in human history. The banned prophecy of Ezra doesn't just predict the end of an age. It reveals the beginning of something so new, so unprecedented that it required the collapse of everything familiar to create space for its emergence. And according to the final seal teaching, you're not just witnessing this emergence, you're meant to participate in it. But are you ready for what that participation requires? Because what we've discovered so far about spiritual breathing, invisible churches, and direct divine communication is just the foundation for practices and responsibilities that go far beyond anything conventional religion has ever imagined possible. The question isn't whether you believe these banned prophecies are true. The question is whether you're prepared to live as if they are to reorganize your entire approach to spirituality around the possibility that everything Ezra saw is not just ancient history but present reality. Because according to the final revelation hidden in these forbidden texts, that's exactly what's required of those who would participate consciously in the spiritual transformation these prophecies describe. And that transformation, according to Ezra's ultimate vision, isn't just about individual enlightenment or personal spiritual fulfillment. It's about the emergence of an entirely new form of human consciousness. One capable of creating kinds of community, relationship, and planetary stewardship that become possible only when human beings learn to live from their deepest spiritual authenticity rather than from the fear and separation that have dominated human civilization for millennia. But the banned prophecy also warns that this transformation won't happen automatically or universally. It will emerge only through individuals who have the courage to live these hidden teachings rather than just study them, who are willing to risk everything familiar for the possibility of becoming something unprecedented. The ultimate question these forbidden prophecies pose isn't whether the end times are coming. It's whether you're ready to be part of what comes next.